This webinar is sponsored by Absorbing. Effectively caring for horses' hooves is a vital part of their health. Absorbing has a way for you to take hoof care one step further with Hoof Flex Magic Cushion.
Welcome everybody. The webinar topic for tonight is better practices for springtime hoof care. I'm Renchin, technical editor of the American Farriers Journal, and I'll give you a little bit of a preview of coming attractions for tonight. What we're going to be talking about is what I call the flying shoe season. This is the time right after generally a big rainstorm, or where we see the thrown shoes, the shelly walls, and the thin soles. We're going to be talking about how we can kind of put our heads together as farriers and what we can do about it. We're going to investigate what our clients can do to help us in terms of turnout and protective boots. And we're going to talk about some health issues that we see commonly in the spring, such as thrush, scratches, white line disease, abscesses, and laminitis. So, the flying shoe season is a nationwide problem, so don't feel like the Lone Ranger when it comes to having problems, but it is a little bit different all across the country. I was born in Minnesota and started shoeing there, and there we have the frozen cold tundra, and in wintertime it's really a very, very good regenerative time for horses' feet. Usually about February and March we start getting freezing and thawing, and the ground gets pretty lumpy and bumpy, and the horses stand around quite a bit. Along about in April and early May, we get the warmer temperatures, and that turns to mud. And this is not an uncommon sight in Minnesota and Wisconsin. So what happens when the frost comes out of the ground, this old Spot here gets to feel that sunshine on his back, and he kind of feels like a derby contender, and he's off to the races and starts running in that field. And pretty soon he's slipping and sliding around, and the next thing you know that he's got his shoe off. And I do believe that there are some horses that actually have a sense of humor and really kind of seem to get a kick out of this because they do it on somewhat on a regular basis. In other parts of the country it's a little bit different. In Arizona and California, in the Southwest, what they'll do is their winter times can be very hot and dry. But that can change literally overnight when it starts raining, and they have these monsoons, and it doesn't take very, very long for these feet to go from good to bad. Another thing that I was talking to Chad Lunderville in Tucson, Arizona, and they also have irrigated pastures down there, which cause a lot of problems that kind of almost mimic springtime conditions. Here in Florida, wintertime is also a good time for horses' feet, but they really have a long, bad season down here. Generally, it starts in June and goes through the end of August. With the heat and humidity, the good feet go bad and the bad feet go worse, and it's really a tough place to keep a good foot on a horse. And then there are poor people in the Pacific Northwest who have almost the annual flying shoe season, and I feel sorry for them up there. So we'll talk about what happens when good feet go bad and the flying shoe season, like what the heck is going on. The first thing is don't panic, that generally this is all weather related and it's not going to last forever. And we have to understand the role of weather, that water can be our best friends, but when in excess it can be their worst nightmare. So what can farriers do to prevent pulled shoes other than praying? One of the options, use bigger and more nails. That is an option, but don't go crazy. If you're using 4 or 5 or 6 nails, it might be better to go to a bigger size nail, or maybe a little bit stiffer nail. But don't think you're going to be keeping these shoes on lots of time with bigger nails. Don't go to the big railroad spikes, and when you get there, if you have a pulled shoe, you have half of the foot connected with it. It's much better off to have them use a smaller nail and have them pulled clean. The other thing is people start to worry that maybe their shoes are a little bit too long, a little bit too full. Again, I kind of go with the Goldilocks method. I don't like my shoes too long, I don't like them too short, I don't like them too tight, I don't like them too full. Generally, in fact, some people will actually put a little bit more shoe on in an effort to kind of give them a little bit more stability and keep them sinking into the ground, and that's an option. but don't start trying to hide those heels, because all that's going to do is lean the corns. Lots of times or in fact, these shoes will always widen up just a little bit, or these feet will widen up a little bit, and next thing you know, you're having to come over your shoes, and then you have a real mess on your hands. The other option is to maybe change shoes. Over the years, I've gone from egg bars to straight bars, and then at the end here to a pad with a frog support system with impression material, and so that might be an option. But don't take, if you have a horse with pads on, don't start pulling all of your pads up, because it doesn't take very long for these feet to get hard and dry again, and generally these horses need those pads. Spoon heels is a possibility. A spoon heel is projection that comes up the back of the heel of the shoe. Generally what you want to do is you want to use a size larger shoe than what you'd normally have on them. There are several different ways of forging these things. This one is done by my friend Dave Farley. One of the things you want to be aware of is to make sure you have about 1/8 of an inch space between the spoon and the heel. During the reset period, these shoes will migrate forward just a little bit, and if you have them snug to begin with, what they'll do is they'll dig into the heel a little bit, and you don't want that. This is another option of spooning the heels. It's a little bit of a preference as to how you want to go about this. Spoon heels really work nice on horses in hilly pastures. When they come down these hills, lots of times what they'll do is they'll lose purchase on the ground coming down, and that hind foot will come up and pull those front shoes off. And so where they're continually exposed to these conditions, lots of times a spoon heel will kind of get you out of that fix. Another thing you do is just change your technique. Lots of times you can get by with cold shoeing with no clips in the wintertime. When those feet start getting a little bit shelly and softer, lots of times it's best to go with a hot fitting and with clips. The other thing, if you're continually losing shoes, you might want to improve your shoeing technique just a little bit. That might mean mentoring with someone, possibly improving your fitting, your clinching, safeting the edges, and especially not resetting worn out shoes. Unanimously, when I talk to people about the best way to deal with this flying shoe season, they said is to shorten up the shoeing intervals. Whatever your shoeing intervals, like not most of the time in the north, we can get away within 8 weeks in the winter time. During the summer, lots of times I shot a lot of my horses at 5 weeks. Here in Florida, it's not unheard to shoe these horses at 3 weeks. So it's always that last week that where things start going bad. And so you have to convince your customers that it's a good investment to let you take charge of that shoeing schedule and do the horses maybe a little bit earlier than when they look like they're doing it before they start falling apart. Another thing is to keep track of the hind feet. That even though oftentimes the front shoes are pulled off, it's the hind feet that are the problem. In fact, that if you have a pointy-toed shoe on with a long toe, I like to shoe with a square-toed shoe on the hind feet. I like to pull them back just a little bit and have everything kind of rounded up. And the other thing that I like to do is put just a little bit of a rocker on those square toes. And again, what that'll do is it'll give you possibly just that little fraction of an inch, which is as good of a mile when these horses are traveling. To charge or not to charge for pulled shoes is an individual decision. Just about everybody I talked to was of equal opinion that if you're at a barn working and somebody shows up with a horse and a shoe in hand, generally it'll get put on for nothing. Or if you're driving by and it's not an inconvenience for you to stop in and put the shoe on, generally there's no charge. But if you have to drive or make a special trip some distance, with the price of fuel these days, I don't think it's unreasonable to ask that client to kind of share some of those expenses, and consequently, I think you probably should start charging for pulled shoes. So, client education is a big part of our job. They have to be aware of the flying shoe season because injuries to expensive horses and choice horses during turnout can be a career and life-threatening experience. I've seen this happen a number of times where real good horses have been hurt during turnout. So we have to clue our clients into what they can do to prevent the shoeing, pulling, and injury. First thing I do is try to get them not to turn out on the bad days. Just about every stable I know has tack And so on these days, if you can saddle them up and ride them. The other thing, if that's not possible, is to turn them out in an indoor arena. Turnout and round pens are really good. And the hot walkers, I think, are excellent, especially the one on the right, with the freestanding one where they can buck and play and not be encumbered. It's also really great to put these guys in the hot walker before they go out on pasture. It kind of takes the edge off them, so when they get out there, they don't run. They'll go to grazing and consequently not hurt themselves. The other thing is to provide a suitable surface for the horses when they go out. This is a picture of my little driving ponies at home. I used to have a terrific mud puddle right there and where I've had these ponies. I got about 6 loads of traffic bond put in there and had it mounted up in the center, and consequently it worked out great. After hard rain, everything would drain off, and these little guys had feel like little mountain goats. Another thing that I found on the internet is this stuff called hoof base. It's a kind of a waffle-like stuff that you put down, and it'd be really good for areas near the gates, especially if you have a little bit of a slope. It'll kind of keep everything in place, and I think there might be something to this. For horses that run, again, a turnout in a small sand paddock is good. It kind of keeps them from getting up any kind of speed. The other thing to do is eliminate the corners in the paddocks. That very often will happen is that horses will run into these corners, they'll slam on the brakes, they'll get a little bit of a hold start there, and the next thing you know, they're jerking a shoe off, or they're catching their heels, or they're hurting their backs, or stifles, or hocks. As I go around the country and I see more and more new fence building, I'm seeing less and less of the corners and more of the fences that have sloping ends to them, and consequently they're getting away from the corners, and I think that's a real improvement in design. So foot and leg protection, just about every good barn that I've ever shot at, when the horses go out there, they go out protected in splitting boots and bell boots. I especially like the bell boots, the ones in the upper left, the slip-on ones. It's important to get them in the correct size. It doesn't take very long to get them on and off, and it's very difficult for a horse to get them out and turn off. The Velcro ones, you want to make sure that you buy the good ones that have the good Velcro. Some of the lighter ones now, especially the no-turn ones, are good, but make sure they go out with something on their feet. Grab boots is not something that also we see a lot, especially in the jumper ring. This is what they look like on. Unfortunately, the only picture I could find are ones that are upside down. If there's a way of getting something wrong, but people will figure it out. These are kind of an elastic rubber, and they go around the heels, and they provide good protection. They are relatively cheap. They're about from $8 to $12, depending upon where you find them, and they're available at all of the big tack supply places. This is another new product that I've just saw. It's called Shoe Secure. They're made in Scotland. They've just started being distributed in Europe. Joy Ream at Palm Beach Farrier Supply as a distributor here in the United States. They're made of a soft plastic. The downside is they have to be put on with a shoe that's drilled and tapped. They have their own little special studs that go in, but I have not seen these yet, but I think they have real promise, and I'm really curious to see what the feedback on these things is going to be. As far as products to put on the horse's feet, they fill the shelves of all the tack stops and the Farrier supplies. There's kind of a different mindsets on what works. There's the ones that are the dehydrators like Keratex and Durasol. The thing is that they draw the moisture out of the foot to harden it. Keratex, they recommend painting the entire foot with, and used a lot in Europe and very effective. I've used Durasol quite a bit for the bottom of the sole, and that will take the stiffness or the soreness out of a sole very quickly. The other mindset are the oil-based products. Venice turpentine is put on hot generally on the soles. Merkel hoof oil and Farrier's Fix and Dave Birdsall's products can go put on the entire foot, and A lot of people think that this is the way to go. And Tough Stuff and Hoof Shield are other products that are sealants, and so whichever way you want to go is your own personal preference. I personally don't have any favorites in this lines. One thing I do advocate my clients is those when the horses come in at night, I want them to go to bed with clean, dry feet. That means that after they're cleaned up, I like to have them either stand in the wash stall or when I was shoeing for the Milwaukee Polo Club, they always had their horses stand in an area that was soft sand, and it was very dry, and these horses had beautiful. I think, but that's very, very important to put these horses away with clean, dry feet. So we'll get into some of the health issues of what happens during the flying shoe season. If I had $1 for every time I've been asked if a horse has thrush, I wouldn't have to be doing this thing tonight. I would be at my villa in the Riviera. Thrush is caused by a bacteria called Staphylococcus necrophoris. That's my only $10 word for this seminar, so I'll be satisfied with that. Thrush is generally seen in either the medial or lateral sulcuses or the central sulcus. And the medial or lateral sulcuses, it's not much of an effort to control. You just have to keep it picked out and cleaned. Copper tox is probably the most popular solution right now. Anything that kills bacteria will work. You have to be careful with the copper tox. It can be a little bit astringent, especially when you don't want to use a lot of it, especially on a horse with white legs. It'll sometimes burn them just a little bit. And the old cheapest one is just use Clorox. Now, thrush in the central sulcus is lots of times a condition that an owner is not even aware of. But anytime you can take a hoof pick and you can stick it down the china there, you have to kind of get that cleaned up because it's only going to get worse. So what I like to use is a combination of ictamol and copper sulfate. I like to mix up a kind of a paste with the ictamol and copper sulfate for the cases with the real sensitive deep cases. If it's on the mild cases, what I'll do is I'll use just the copper sulfate alone. So we'll go about how we do it. What you need are some copper sulfate powder and some cotton balls. And what you do is you just dribble a little bit of that copper sulfate powder down into that central sulcus, and gently, and I mean gently, kind of massage it in there. If the horse resists or objects, he probably has a deep case, into which at that point you want to stop and then mix up the ictamol and the paste, and use that solution until that gets quieted down a little bit, and then you can go back and use the copper sulfate powder straight. So after you have that copper sulfate put all the way to the bottom, what you want to do is you want to get an appropriate sized piece of cotton, stick that in there, and then just gently massage that in there and trying to put it down all the way to the bottom. What you try to do is keep the good stuff in and the bad stuff out. And then just leave it flush with the bottom of the frog there. Tell your client not to disturb it. And generally it'll take 2 to 3 applications during the reset cycle, and you can get that totally cleared up. Canker is another situation that's a little bit out of our realm, but you should recognize it when you see it. This is not in our area to tackle. This is a veterinarian issue. What they'll end up probably doing is put a tourniquet on this horse's leg, excise all of this necrotic tissue down to nice, live, healthy tissue, and it can be a bloody mess. And so that's something that you want your veterinarian to get involved in. It's not something you want to tackle yourself. Scratches is another one that's really not a hoof issue, but it's something that we see quite often. We're the first ones to see it. Lots of times an owner will not recognize it. They'll think they're just a little bit of dirt and crud on the leg, but it's actually the start of a skin infection. It always starts on horses with white legs, and lots of times this is the first symptoms of it. These are pictures of cases in various stages of severity. What you want to do is you want to catch it when it looks like that bottom right one, and not when it gets to the bottom left, not to the upper right. These horses are very, very difficult to work on when they when they progress to this end stage like this. You pick the foot up and they'll shake it like it's on fire because it is very, very painful. So when you see these cases like this, what you want to do is you want to alert the client, get them on it, get them to call the vet and get it involved. There are several different ways of treating scratches, and every veterinarian has their own little favorites, and so clients really appreciate this when you point this stuff out. White line disease is a condition, I think, that is misnamed. It should really be called stratum medium disease because it really doesn't have that much to do with the white line. But whenever I'm working on a foot and I see that little cavity right there in the wall in the stratum medium, I immediately tell my client we've got a problem there, and I'm very aggressive on these things. What I like to do is I like to go after them right away and open them up, get them exposed to air, put a little bit of thrush buster on them so I can see if they're we've got everything cut out, and then just wait for them to grow down. And as they come back down, I'll continually check it and probe it to make sure that it's all gone. If we don't, what will happen is these things will progress to this point here, and ultimately, if you really leave it go, this is the worst case scenario. That luckily these things will stop at the coronary band and the heels, but when you get them to this point here, they're very, very difficult to work with, and you're talking about a horse who's probably going to have a few months off, and it's a very difficult case to keep them happy, especially if it's a front foot. Abscesses are another thing that we see after a prolonged period of rain and mud. What happens is that his horse's sole will get saturated and get very, very soft, and they'll step on sometimes a sharp object like a sharp stone, and what it'll do is it'll create a little bit of a fissure in that sole, and it's okay as long as the sole is nice and soft that bacteria can kind of come in and out of that. But what happens is when the foot dries up, what you'll do is you get a little bit of a hard callus on the outside, and that bacteria is encapsulated inside that sole, and the next thing you know, that you've got an abscess. So how do you tell when a horse has an abscess? It can come on very sudden. I've seen horses that are being a jumping lesson, and they've jumped a serious jump, and all of a sudden they land from one, and they're three-legged lame, and it almost looks like they've broken their leg, but all they really have is an abscess. So in these things, what you want to do is you want to check for a strong digital pulse, both resting and moving, increase heat in the foot, pull the shoe and clean up the sole, look for a tract, check with the hoof tester, and be aware that sometimes horses with thick, hard soles will not always test positive. So this is a typical horse that has an abscess exhibiting pointing with the foot. You go over and you'll check for digital pulse. The arteries run over each side of those sesamoid bones, and to check for a pulse is a good skill to have. Anytime you have inflammation in that foot, the blood circulation is not going to be normal, and so the heart is trying to push blood through that foot and it won't go, and that's what creates that increased digital pulse. I like to put them on the lunge line to just observe exactly how late they are and if that digital pulse comes up. And then what I prefer to do is I like to go ahead and pull the shoe right away, and just to make sure that everything is okay with the nails. And I like to clean that foot up very, very gently and start looking for a tract. If I come to a spot that I suspect is the culprit, what I'll do is I'll put a hoof tester on him. These are the hoof testers I recommend. They're made by Riding. They're adjustable. They're made of stainless steel. They have a little bit of spring in the handle, and it's a very good design that you can use them effectively all the way from little tiny foals up to a big warm blood foot. They are a little pricey. They're about $175, $80, but unless you lose them or they're stolen, they'll probably last you the rest of your life. Of all the hoof testers I've used, these are my absolute favorites. So if you can find the abscess and the tract, what you want to do is you want to open and drain it. If not, very often the old advice is to soak them in hot water and Epsom salts. And I could never quite figure out how this worked, because Epsom salts is a drawing agent. What it does is it draws the moisture out of that hoof capsule and makes it hard as a rock. And so what will happen is that the foot will get so hard that abscess has no place to go but to rupture at the coronary band or come out the heel. And this is a very, very painful process for the horse. And so I think there's a much better way of doing this. This is an animal. This is Animal Intex. It's a product that I much prefer over the Epsom salts for initial soaking. I'll direct you to a YouTube video. It's called Bandaging a Horse's Foot. It's a little over 5 minutes long, and it's by my friend Dr. Mike Ponell from Ontario, Canada. And he goes through the entire process of how Animal Intex works. What he starts out with is a duct tape sheet that he puts together and just puts that on his leg for later use. And then the Animal Intex is a sheet of cotton impregnated with boric acid. It has a plastic backing on one side. What you do is you submerge it in hot water and then drape it over the entire foot. Then take vet wrap and tape the entire foot up. And then you take that sheet of duct tape and place that over the bottom of the foot, and then take the rest of the roll, and you can make a nice little hoof boot out of it. What you want to do then is keep this boot on for 24 to 48 hours. At the end of that time, pull that back off, put the hoof testers back on the foot, and lots of times that foot is softened up enough where you can locate that abscess site and then drain it from the bottom, and then you don't have to open it all the way up from the top. At that time, you can dry pack the foot, or at that point, you can use Epsom salts to toughen it up. But this is a much better product to use rather than the Epsom salts and hot water bath. Now, laminitis is another word that strikes terror into the hearts of all horsemen. There's nothing prettier than seeing a horse out there in the pasture and grass up to his knees, and these little fat ponies running around are cute as can be. That is until they're not running so much anymore. In fact, they can't run at all, and they can hardly make it back to the barn. Another thing we're seeing now is so many more of these metabolic horses. It's not much of a problem when they're young, but when they reach those early teens, it gets to be a real issue. Whenever you see these horses, they're starting to develop these big fat crusty necks, a lot of fat over the tail heads, and there's no way you can find those ribs because there's like 2 or 3 inches of fat over them. You know that this is a disaster waiting to happen. So the real key to managing these horses is to manage their feed, their exercise, and put them on the proper medications. One of the ways of dealing with them, especially if they have to, if the owner insists on them going down in pastures, at least put a muzzle on them. There are lots of different brands, and it slows their grazing down and keeps them from getting all of those fructans into their system. A better system actually is to put them on a dry lot. That way you control exactly what they're eating, and it's a much better system. A lot of people feel this is not exactly humane, that but actually you're doing the best thing for the horse. Another thing that I was unaware of is that down here in Florida, during the month of July and August is a real dangerous time for metabolic horses. The problem is that at night, the temperatures remain high, and anytime they don't get down below 65 degrees, the horse cannot dissipate enough of his body heat at night, and consequently it sets on a laminitic episode, and lots of times they can be quite severe. And so we have any old fat metabolic horses listening to this, beware of staying out of Florida here in July and August. For the horses that do contract laminitis, kind of now the generally accepted method that I believe works the best is to get them in ice water, generally for 72 hours. The other thing is to get some kind of caudal support on them. Impression material is my choice. You can kind of build it up a little bit on the back. And then the use of the Renchin Ultimate Wedge is a little bit of a personal one, but if it is used, generally it is used with the impression material. Generally, after the case is settled down a little bit, lots of times they'll be transferred into the EVA shoe with the wood. I like this because what the horse can do is he can find his own comfort zone there. After they're doing well in this, lots of times they'll be transferred into the wooden shoe. Dr. Redden's Banana shoes are also very popular. The way it's kind of going is to have some mechanics in these feet now to kind of take that pressure off of that toe and get that breakover eased. This is a shoe that I've used successfully at home, and I like it. It's a full support shoe. I like to put a leather rim pad on top, and then I open up that heel, so we're getting absolutely no sole pressure. And then it's put on with impression material on the caudal part. Then I like to fill that cavity up at that front part of the shoe with Forstner's hoof packing. What that does is it keeps that sole nice and soft. So if you have a coffin bone that's descending, it's pushing down on that softer sole rather than a hard one. The other thing is on the bottom, it's a hospital plate. It's 3/8 thick plastic, and it's put on with screws. And so what you can do is if you can get a lot of mechanics in this thing and you really get that breakover all the way back, and it works quite well. The other thing that I've heard is being experimented with is the use of a hyperbaric chamber. This is a chamber where the barometric pressure is just dropped down, and then it's filled with oxygen. What it does is it supplies a high level of oxygen to these horses' feet. The downside of it is that they say for it to be effective, they need about 30 treatments, and each treatment is from $300 to $500 a pop. And so economically, it's not feasible for a lot of horses. Another shoe that's still used widely is Bernie Chapman's Heart Bar. It still has his people that really like it, and I still think there's probably still a genuine use for this shoe. I would like to thank the people who kind of helped me put this thing together, the people from Bisbee's and Palm Beach Farrier Supply here in Wellington, and my good buddies at Gabriel's and Brooklyn Bagels for all of their help they gave me and advice.
So let's begin with this, Red. Do you see a lot of traction when using rocker toes on the hinds?
No, not at all. That has never been an issue. Again, it's just very, very slightly. You don't go crazy with these things, and it's probably only rocked them up maybe like an eighth of an inch out of level, and so no, that's not an issue.
Okay, here's a question. When you went through flying shoe season, there's a lot of variables. This question is more so: where's the best place to start to try to find out what I should change without, maybe trying to change too much and introducing a new problem?
The thing is to kind of investigate exactly what happened and find out where, first off, to find out where that shoe is. If it's out there in the deep mud and nobody can find it because it's down 6 inches and lost probably forever, then the problem isn't really yours. It's the turnout situation, and so you have to advise your client that they can't be doing that. You have to wait until the conditions are a little bit drier. If you find the shoe and one heel is sprung, you might want to take and just put a little bit of a spoon on that heel. But the thing is to try and find out the cause of the problem. Lots of times it can be just a bad step. The horse was just having a frisky day, and very often it's just a matter of putting the shoe back on and hoping for the best. And lots of times that's all it'll be. It'll be just like a one-time bad step, and really it's not anybody's fault, but it's just kind of bad luck.
Hey, Red, here's somebody. They're just kind of curious on what kind of horses that you worked with.
I worked primarily with warm bloods in the latter part of my career. I started out with Western horses and then migrated over to the hunter and jumper industry, and that's been the focus of my career. They're great horses to work on.
Okay, here's somebody that wants a tip for client communication. It sounds like maybe their problem is they have a client who's blamed the farrier first on the lost shoe thing. It's a two-part question. What would you suggest for better managing in that conversation? And two, managing that conversation to direct them that you're going to charge them for coming out to replace that lost shoe?
Again, it all comes down to relationships. that we all have customers that are different, all the way from the backyard ones who the only time that horse's feet ever gets picked up is just when we do it, all the way to the people who are very, very conscientious. And what you want to do is progress and in your career, and kind of disassociate yourself away from the people who won't cooperate, and create all of these problems for you that are sometimes never ever going to be solved simply because they won't take the initiative to do it. And so generally you can tell who these people are, and if you're going to be able to be of any have any kind of impact on their thinking and of their management.
Okay. Now going back to shoeing, when the shoe's secure, do you find any issues with dirt or sand getting in and causing a raw spot?
Again, I have not seen them yet, but with all of these products, with bell boots and splint boots and all that stuff, again, what you have to understand is the fact that when those horses come back in, these things have to come off, and that foot has to be cleaned up. And if you do that on a regular basis, I don't think you're going to have any kind of irritation problems.
Okay. Hey everybody, just a reminder, let's get some more questions in. We got Red here for a while. We just got a couple more questions here, so let's not let's take advantage of this opportunity to have Red answer your questions. Red, let's talk a little bit about here's another question regarding clients, and I think it's a lot of what you already talked about, but it gets onto the subject of that obese horse of what should you do within springtime to, maybe when you're not seeing that horse as regularly, about keeping that client educated on the dangers of hoof care related to the overweight horse without offending that owner.
Very often what happens is their clients are really not aware of what is happening to that horse, and when we see it maybe every 6 weeks, and we remember what he looked like 6 weeks ago when we arrive, and all of a sudden he's 50, 75, or 100 pounds heavier. That's a big red flag going up, and so that's when we really need to alert our clients again to something needs to be done, because they are heading down the wrong path with this horse, and anybody who's seen a horse with severe laminitis will never forget it, because it's a terrible, pitiful sight. And so you really have to kind of sometimes put the fear of God into them a little bit, in terms of they've got to do something, because if they really like this horse, they are really doing him a disservice without decreasing his feed and increasing his exercise, and maybe getting some medication.
Okay. Fred, when you talked a little bit about animal Lintex over a 24 to 48 hour period, are you talking about one application of it or changing it out? And if so, how many times?
Yes, generally what you want to do is you want to put a fresh one on. Lots of times it doesn't take more than 2 applications. But I like to use the whole sheet and do the entire foot. That way you really get that entire foot saturated, and very often what you can do is on one application you can find that abscess site. And if it's a real deep one, and they do come out the sole or the coronary band or the back of the heel, it'll be a much smaller opening and much less damage to the foot. Yeah, and so it's a real good product, and generally you're not going to have to do it more than twice.
Okay, Red, here's a question from a farrier and a boarder. Sounds like she's really demands for that dry, appropriate turnout and hopes. Do you have any thoughts on how to influence what is available in terms of dry lot or drained pasture?
Again, you just have to strike up a conversation with them and impress upon them the importance of having a dry place for this horse if he wants to go outside, and all the detrimental effects that can happen when he has to go out in the mud in terms of pulling off his shoes and the abscess problems and all of the other things that can go with it. And so again, it's a matter of just taking a few minutes and educating your client, and sometimes they really have to be taken by the hand and shown the way.
Yeah, it seems a lot of the questions I'm seeing here have a lot to do with client management. And, here's another one going back to overweight horses. This farrier often gets questions regarding diet. What are your thoughts regarding what's appropriate for a farrier to cover with in terms of feed and diet? And, what sources would you refer them to?
Generally, what I like to do is I like to have a good relationship with a veterinarian with all of my clients, and luckily in my career that has been my experience. But we as farriers can alert the clients as to an obese horse or a metabolic horse kind of going down the road. But in terms of diet and health issues, I would not want to be the sole one to dictate exactly what this horse's program is going to be, and I would want that to be part of the veterinarian's responsibility in terms of health management of these guys. That don't take it upon your sole responsibility to tell these people how to take care of the horses, because it is part of our management, but it also falls more mainly in the domain of the veterinarian.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about thrush. This question's specific about thrush buster. Do you ever find that you can overuse it? And maybe what have you seen with other products? Or is there ever a concern about overuse of thrush buster or any of the other products?
The problem that I've encountered in the past with overuse is the fact with thrush in the central sulcus, that I have seen occasions where people got a little bit overzealous with the topical medications, and what they did is they created a real hard frog, and what this does is it really encapsulates all of that bacteria down inside that central sulcus, and when that happens is that this stuff will proliferate almost like an abscess, and then it will get to the point where it will really start bothering a horse and causing him soreness. And so whenever I tell people to medicate their horse with these solutions, caution them to put it only in the medial and lateral sulcuses and stay away from that central sulcus. That again, if you have a fissure in that central sulcus and you can stick a probe down in there, then you have to treat that a little bit differently. But you don't want to be putting stuff over the top. That's why the powder works so well, is that you can force it all the way to the bottom and actually get it to heal almost like an open wound, where you have to get it to heal from the bottom up. If you try to heal it from the top down, all you're going to is lead to frustration and more problems.
Okay, regarding those situations, let's exclude a pulled shoe in this case, but maybe in a case of like an abscess, where it's going to be something you have to manage over time. How do you handle that in terms of your billing and working with the client on that?
I do charge for opening abscesses. Again, I think this is something that does fall within our realm, that if done properly, you shouldn't be getting any blood. And so again, it's kind of a time and materials thing, where I have to make a special trip to look at a horse that's come up lame. I'll charge for the trip, and then I'll charge for the abscess or opening the abscess, and then I will I will charge for the materials. And my customers have been happy with that, and I think even the veterinarians probably like a little bit, because that generally they're busy in the springtime too, and they've got enough to do, and anything that we can do to help out. And it does take a little bit away from income, but I think if you have a good relationship with your vet, that's not going to be an issue.
Okay. Here's an interesting question. This doesn't necessarily have. This is at all times of the year. Red, in your history, I'm sure there are times that a vet asked you something to have you do something that maybe wasn't in the best interest of the horse. Let's say that vet feels he is right. What would you do? And would you do what they ask? Would you step aside? What was your history with something like that?
when you work as long as I have, yeah, you run into all kinds of veterinarians, and the young veterinarians are sometimes the biggest problem if they're aggressive. And yes, I have been in instances where people have had me do things that I thought were going to be detrimental to the horse's health, and I've had to politely refuse. That I would much rather kind of excuse myself from the case than be involved in something that went horribly wrong, especially if I had a real strong opinion that what we were doing was not ethical or moral, and not in the best interest of that horse. So I think in interest of your reputation, sometimes it is best to excuse yourself and tell them that you just simply cannot and will do that. And then they can figure out that it's their decision then as to whether they want to continue on that present course and get somebody else, or maybe change their mind. And then sometimes it goes one way and sometimes it goes the other. But it's all about personalities and situation and unique situations, and you just have to sort it out on the case by case basis. It's not an easy decision to make when you're faced with that one. And I really feel bad for anybody that's put in that position.
Okay. For our last question, we're going to go back to thrush, and here's a farrier in Maryland. It's very prevalent in Maryland due to the wetness of the environment. Is it prudent in the cases you find to trim it all away, or just the loose tags of the frog and then medicate? Let's maybe review, in your very wet environments that you worked in, certainly Wisconsin at times, how you would approach that.
First thing you need is a very, very sharp knife, and that is to not cut much tissue away, but only cut away those little ragged tears and not get into sensitive tissue. The last thing that you want to do is get any kind of bleeding or sensitivity on that foot, and so you want to be very judicious in what you cut away. Again, let the products do their work as far as killing the bacteria, and then after you have that done, then you can kind of go to work and with your knife a little bit more and shape that frog up. But on the real severe cases, what you want to do is you want to be very, very carefully and gently probe the confines of those sulcuses, and if they are sensitive, leave that hoof knife in the box and get it calmed down and cleaned up a little bit before you start carving away.
Okay, with that, I just want to thank you, Red. I think this was a real wonderful way to spend the evening, a lot of information packed in, and I think we all learned a lot.
Very good, thank you. I appreciate your patience and attention, and good luck to everybody out there.